Today, the title is just a really easy one to start off. Yeah, not, but how the current federal decisions are impacting New York. We're going to be touching on, we hope, a little bit about the executive orders, about DEI, about title programs, about vouchers in school, and basically, maybe if we have time, federal funding. So there is a lot to get to today because a lot is happening. And I am so pleased that Daniel Morton-Bentley is with us today. Daniel is counsel and deputy commissioner for the New York State Education Department. I have had the pleasure of working with Daniel for a number of years and can see his excellent work in every Board of Regents meeting. You can just see the behind the scenes work that Daniel is always doing. So Daniel, thank you so much for helping us navigate all of this.
Hi, Cindy. Thank you so much for having me.
If you don't mind, Daniel, what I'd like to do is just share two quick slides to kind of give us some context for the conversation today.
Sure.
I'm going to assume, Daniel, you can see this the screenshot there?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you all for taking the time to complete the survey that we sent out prior to this session. And one of the questions that we asked, I think pretty much sums up why we're doing our Update Live series. But the question was, will these executive orders require your district to revise the policies and practices in your district? And you can see by the response, it was kind of like, yes, no, maybe so. We kind of think so. Daniel, it's like we have a lot of information, but we kind of don't know how to process any of this or what we need to do with it. And then the second slide that I want to just throw up, the intent of this Update Live is not to go through and explain all of these executive orders or the kind of directives that are coming out of the U.S. Department of Ed, but to give you a flavor. And then I'm going to throw a question to Daniel. But you can see, I'm just going to give you a flavor for the first couple ones. But on January 20th, one of the first executive orders was defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government. And basically, behind those words is it's a statement that gender identity was a false kind of construct and that there are two biological sexes, male and female, and that's what he's basing the presidential order on. Give you a flavor of another one. On January 29th, expanding education.
Cindy, sorry, it's not being shared. I can't see it.
Okay, let's try this again. Paul, I'm not sure why it says it's sharing on mine. Is that better? You see the first one, Paul?
Can't see it.
All right, excuse us, folks, just for a second. Let me.
I can share.
There we go. I got it. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the second slide, the second rather directive was on January 29th, expanding educational freedom and opportunities for families. And basically that is AKA expanding charter schools, private schools. And then on January 29th, ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schooling, which basically gets to a lot of the heart of the DEI kind of initiatives. So Daniel, ready for a question from us to help us navigate, but can you kind of tell us what the executive orders really are? Do they apply to New York? And if not, what actions would we need to take place in order for them to directly override then New York state law? Help us.
Sure. So the good news is all of the school ones don't impact anything that we are doing in New York. And even though this looks like a lot on this page, there's actually way more of these executive orders. So these are, it's a genre that lets the federal executive take actions that are deemed necessary to manage the federal government. And in that context, there's some things that are very close to the president's fingertips that can be a proper subject of these, like the military. So the president has much more control over the military to issue executive orders to say, do X now. But we're dealing with education, and it's very far removed in that, both political parties, it's rare to find a bipartisan issue, but both understand that education is primarily a state function. The federal government has provided a lot of guidance, support, money over the past several decades, but it is chiefly a state and local concern. So looking at all of these documents, they make very strong statements of policy in very strident and frankly, occasionally jarring and offensive language. But these do not impact the state policies that we have. And you would need to see a congressional change before you would have to adjust to any of this. So, and even then, there are some things that may be within Congress's control, such as Title IX, how it would like to define that law and its scope. But something like DEI, that's touching upon curricula, that's touching upon teachers, administrators, academic freedom to prescribe material for the classroom. And one of them here, looking at the list, is just kind of like a red herring here, saying you can't have COVID-19 vaccine mandate. We're unaware of any K-12 institution that has such a mandate. So again, reiterating that these are primarily policy documents looking to shift the tone rather than make a legal change.
So Daniel, maybe you could pick up just for a second. You said it would take a congressional change. Maybe you can just highlight a couple of those, just give us a sense of how difficult that is, because saying that it's just a statement is one thing, but having your community behind you saying, or, that whole flavor. So you were explaining it to me the other day, and I thought, wow, that's a lot that has to happen in order for this to even begin to override New York State.
Yeah, so the first step would be that this would have to be something uniquely within Congress's control, that they can say, we do this and we want to change our position on it. You'd have to persuade enough people to, change or amend the law. Title IX, as many of you know, hasn't been touched. It's a handful of words. I don't remember 20-something words. Congress hasn't done anything with it in over 50 years, and that's because it's hard. It's hard to get people to agree to those monumental changes. And that's why a lot of the Title IX development has been regulatory in nature, because all the government has to let you know is it's taking a different interpretation. You get a chance to weigh in, and then there'll be judicial review. So that's what I would expect here. If, for example, Congress wants to pass the Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus Act of 2025 and says the United States recognizes these two genders, first you have to get a majority of people to vote for that, and then you're going to have to survive a legal challenge after that. And even then, I think there's a compelling argument by states to say, okay, that's fine that is going to be federal policy, but we can control the health and safety of our citizens, and we exceed your requirement. We protect non-binary people. We protect transgender people. So even assuming Congress made it through all those hoops, it's still going to have to show that it can override state police or education power, those kind of things that are uniquely within the ability of a state to regulate.
Daniel, good. I've got a follow-up question on Title IX, but I want to get one question in here that really pertains to something you said about military. So, Pete, you want to ask that question?
Yes, it's my understanding that these executive orders are applying to the U.S. Department of Defense schools around the world. That is correct, right, Dan?
Yes, those are considered adjuncts of the military rather than a public school system as we would know it.
Understood. Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Quick follow-up. So the military schools that are near our neighboring school districts, does this impact them in any way? Would there be any interaction between what has to happen, or not at all at this point?
It's interesting. Yeah. So for those people on the Department of Defense schools, yes, they can be subject to new policies that, of course, in turn can be challenged. But we have learned occasionally these bases have civilians as well. So right. I haven't thought about that specific issue yet, but needless to say, it has been complicated to explain how it works when you're a civilian on a Department of Defense base and possibly going to schools off the base.
And Daniel has agreed ahead of time, folks, just so you know that we know that this is a quick moving, morphing kind of, all of these topics could change, not quickly, but could change. So Daniel has even been foolish enough to say that he'd even come back and have another update with us when needed. So Daniel, we may take you up on that offer.
For sure.
I want to go down a little bit further. We said we'd be fast paced here. And I want to go right to Title IX then, because as you said, the wording of the, let me go back to that EO just for a second. The first one, defending women from gender ideology. But if you go further and look at this list, is the U.S. Department of Ed letters and statements in regard to Title IX. So basically what we see from the U.S. Department of Ed is a reiteration that we're moving back from the Biden's expansive ruling on gender identity, and that persons who identified as male could, under some circumstances, participate in female sports. So the U.S. Department of Ed certainly reiterated this. And then you basically, what was interesting just recently, I won't go into that, we'll go to another one, but you do have then some actions being taken to the Department of Ed. So what has been New York's response to that, and what guidance, again, are we, but specifically on Title IX, are we giving to school leaders, Daniel?
Yeah. So I will say that SED's issued two statements thus far, one on these executive orders generally, and the other on transgender students' rights, which does touch upon this Title IX issue. So there's a number of things going on with Title IX that, the administration's trying to do or say multiple things at the same time. So one that they're saying is fairly uncontroversial, which is the Biden era Title IX regulations, which were put out by US DOE, went out for comment, and were challenged, that they're saying we hereby rescind those and we want to go back to the ones we had in place prior to that. So that's a pretty uncontroversial position. The scope of that litigation and maybe some of the errors made by courts along the way, I won't get into too much, but the main thing that these courts found across the country was you went one step too far as the federal government trying to define sex. So then, ironically, the administration is also trying to redefine sex, which is the same thing that they were complaining about the Biden US DOE doing. Now they're trying to do that through executive order, saying, well, guess what? Now we have a new definition of sex. So that attempt you can just ignore, in that if they want to take a federal law, which is Title IX, and make a contrary interpretation, they will need to do what the Biden administration did, which is publish a proposed rule, get comment from stakeholders and states, and then reach a final rule that can be challenged in court.
So bottom line for New York State is status quo. We are continuing to protect all of our students under the current regulations.
Yes, and I should say that, the Title IX regulations are massive, and most of them have to do with the paradigm is college campus sexual assault. It still applies to K-12 schools, but you'll note there's a number of provisions in those regulations saying, well, you have some discretion here if you're in a K-12 school, given the age of students and their maturity level. So that's the paradigm of those regulations. And I don't know a percentage, but 90% of it is kind of related to that process. And then the new Biden era one had this. Oh, and sex, by the way, includes transgender people and non-binary people. But all of New York state law protections, in the human rights law, those were in effect even under the old Title IX rule from the Trump administration. So those remain untouched, and you can think about it as a floor ceiling issue that the federal law is establishing, base protections for certain instances involving sex-based interactions and harassment, and state law exceeds that.
Really interesting. Daniel, thank you for that clarification. You know what? I think we're going to stop here for a minute. Let's see if there's any questions that you can, come take yourself off mute, and let's hear some comments, concerns, questions. We'll see where we can go with that. there's one that came in the chat. I wanted to see if we can't get a live question. Anybody have one? And then, or Abigail, could you maybe state your question at least live here? Take yourself up mute. Thanks.
Yeah, give me one sec. Let me just turn on. So, from this, I'm getting the message that, we should keep doing status quo in New York State, like keep protecting our students, all of that. But what kind of power or jurisdiction would there be though for like the president to restrict like our grant funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is that it's illegal to cut off grants for something that's totally unrelated to the grants. And the best example I can use or give you that was litigated during the first Trump administration was the feds tried to say, we're cutting off policing grants to the states because some of your cities have said we're sanctuary cities and we won't help ICE and we want ICE to go away. And their position was, why am I giving out money when the state is telling me it's opposed to my policy initiatives? And overwhelmingly, there was a number of federal court decisions that said, no, you must let that money flow. That these cities are not telling you they won't follow the law. They're saying they're not going to help you do it. And there's, a great sentence from one of them that says basically the president cannot affect policy by controlling money that Congress has authorized.
Perfect.
But if you have seen funding or programs disappearing, you may have heard from USDOE, their research arm. I think that there's an effort at the federal level to look at low-hanging fruit contracts that were already ending, discretionary functions that they operate. But there are procedural rights attendant to withdrawing grants, and just saying, I don't like your policy choices is not one of them.
And Abigail, I don't think you could have set us up any better. So thank you. And I don't even know Abigail yet, but I appreciate, because where I want to move to kind of give, I want to move to just one there. So, but here's a different way on funding. So Daniel, on the school voucher one. So basically the EO under expanding educational freedom and opportunities for families. Okay, so we know that that's about charter schools and private schools, right? But then with the U.S. Department of Ed, what you're beginning to see, and Daniel and I have talked a little bit, that you see monies being added. So there was $33 million provided to charter school management organizations, as well as some actions taken by the USDOE to, in fact, make the process of becoming a charter school or private school far easier by having to get rid of some of the steps or some of the more controversial guidance or regulations. So where do we and so charter schools in New York State is certainly being discussed, as it was at the testimonies for all the budgets, in terms of its impact on public schools. So help us think of how we might be able to think about this issue when it comes to the EOs, the U.S. Department of Ed, and the already impact of charters in New York. No easy question, Daniel.
Yeah, it's I always think of there's one of the first big Supreme Court case about the Administrative Procedure Act, which is the federal law that says how you pass rules, among other things, these like Title IX rules. And Justice Frankfurter said that, in enacting this, Congress enacted a mood, and the mood was reining in agencies, holding them to a higher procedural standard. And but mood is a good descriptor for all these executive orders too. So that's the mood of the charter school one, is that, yes, charters, let the money flow. We want to freely encourage charters to be there and get it and develop. But in New York, we have a comprehensive charter school act. The legislature has been loath to touch it. I suspect, just like Title IX and many others, there's so many opposing views on this that they haven't been able to restructure it. So it's from the late 90s. It certainly could have used updating throughout the years, but has not. But the chart, one of the things that does is set a cap on the number of charters in the state. You may recall from the last budget session, there was disputes about whether they could reopen what are called zombie charters. And that was approved last year, so that a few new ones are going to begin operation. All or most are downstate near New York City. But nevertheless, we do have a cap on charter schools applicable in New York. So even if this executive order says keep the money flowing, it can't lead to just charter schools popping up like mushrooms.
And for those of us like me who are always just a little bit cynical, I'm not saying all the time, Daniel, but just a little bit, in order to get that cap changed or increased, it would take an act of our legislature, which would be an enactment of a law, which is a process in itself.
That is correct.
Okay.
And we did talk about, I think one helpful thing to put on people's horizons, the perfect confluence of religion and charter schools is there is a case pending at Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, about whether Oklahoma could bless a religious charter school within their state. And that proposition was too much, even for the Oklahoma Supreme Court. But stay tuned as to what that means or what the Supreme Court says on that.
We'll watch that. And again, maybe good reason to have you come back again, Daniel.
Sure.
The next topic we're going to hit is DEI, but let me break there. Is there anything that you all would like to raise about the charter schools, or any questions for Daniel while we're holding him here in a controlled setting? Don't be shy. We want this to be really interactive because we really do want these sessions, this new venue, to really get to your questions, because sometimes this is going to be, and to have Daniel's expertise with us at this point is just phenomenal. But we'll move on. DEI.
I have a quick question.
Hey, Saggy.
I'm driving, so I can't look. I just have a question around, maybe he has an answer, DEI, and how there seems to be this fear that if a district is somehow engaged or using language around the DEI terminology, that it could affect funding, or that they'll be penalized in some way. So I know within our group, there's been a lot of discussion and fear around that. We're watching folks in higher education dismantling programs as well as West Point. Do you have any insight on that?
Hey, Daniel, would you mind if because Saggy, I know this wasn't a setup question, just like I know it wasn't from Abigail, but you led us right into this next executive order, which was on the 29th, which said ending radical indoctrination in K through 12 schools. What's really interesting on that is that's really to the heart of all the DEI initiatives. And then further, what's happened on that is the U.S. Department of Ed then eliminated its DEI councils, some of its advisory groups. It canceled DEI training contracts. It has so far withdrawn its equity action plan. U.S. Department of Ed staff in those program offices dealing with DEI have been released or put on some sort of administrative leave. And I believe, Daniel, on the web page, all the DEI resources and statements promoting DEI. But maybe, Daniel, you can lead us into this conversation by also telling us what US DOE has kind of walked back lately in their Q&A. Perfect, Say. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so I think again, the takeaway is no, you don't have to change anything. You shouldn't change anything. Whatever your school's mission and values are, you should maintain that. The administration, other than saying diversity, equity, and inclusion, the feds have not said what that is. So again, it's this mood or this like vibe-based politics where the federal government is saying, it, or you know it when you see it, you can't do it. But to which you should rightly say, I don't know what you're talking about. I do need you to define that. I think that the DEI, as I'm sure all of you know, is a very broad-based commitment to embracing and celebrating difference. And it can include age differences, religious backgrounds, different economic backgrounds. The federal administration, without saying so, has crudely suggested that this is just affirmative action for African Americans. And I think maybe it's the age of some of the cabinet appointees. They're still stuck in 1968 or whatever, the social battles of that era. But obviously, that is an important part of DEI that we should celebrate. But it's also a big, broad, encompassing principle. And differences in students with disabilities are a big part of this too. Inclusion, as someone who started my state service doing nothing but special education review, inclusion is very important too. And that's a core principle of the IDEA, celebrating its 50th anniversary, to include students with disabilities in regular education as much as you can. So yeah, so US DOE stirred panic in the field with a Valentine's Day gift to all of you, to say that you're operating illegal DEI, radical DEI, whatever the adjective of the week is, and we're coming for you, and you have 14 days to stop, or else. Lo and behold, 14 days came and went, and all they had to issue was additional FAQ guidance that largely walked back some of their threats. So US DOE is putting all of its eggs in a single Supreme Court basket, and that is the Students for Fair Admission case. This was a ad hoc group. Actually, I take it back. I don't know if they predated this fight with Harvard and UNC, but activist group, Students for Fair Admission, sued two universities, Harvard, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, alleging that their admissions criteria were race-based and impermissible. The Supreme Court agreed, basically on the rationale that all racial preference in college admissions is subject to a very high bar. It did not say it is always improper, that it's always illegal, but if you do it, it has to be targeted. You have to have basically an action plan for, here is our problem, here is how we are addressing it, and here's where we want to get. And that's one of the more interesting parts of that decision. I think that the Supreme Court encountered this with integration cases too, which is, how long can the judiciary be the guides to get people where they want to get? Sometimes you have things open for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Politicians come in and go, yeah, we're trying, we're working on it, and nothing changes. So, but US DOE has capitalized upon that. They're trying to say that this case about admissions means that anything they call DEI is now illegal and you're on the hook. And don't fall for it. The Attorney General of New York, together with several others, hot off the presses, just yesterday issued guidance on this issue. And here's a key sentence: educational institutions should continue to foster diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility among their student bodies. And that's something I'm glad to share with everybody if they haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, we can do that a couple of ways. You can either send it to me and I'll get it out to all our participants, or if you're able to do that, maybe after we can put the resource in the chat. Right. Daniel, I don't think that answer could have been any more clear. So it isn't just that's a reaffirmation. It's not just a status quo, but it's a reaffirmation of where we are in New York. So thank you for that. So questions at this point or comments? I can't believe it, but we're actually going to get a couple of minutes to talk about federal funding. These have been very complex with a lot of legs and a lot of different variations. But how about anything from your point of view, Saggy? Thank you. But anybody else on DEI?
And I'm not sure if I got to fully answer the question, which was about what about the threats, or what could happen, or what could do. So the avenue would be US DOE enforcement. The government has said today, the federal government, that US DOE may not be long for its world. That's its intention. So, I mean, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth here. It's unclear if, you should be scared because US DOE is coming for you. And then at the same time saying, well, it might not be there at all, so don't worry about it. But if it does persist, and I believe it will, any action taken by a district would be a long and drawn out enforcement action where USDOE would come, they'll investigate, they issue findings. You have the ability to challenge those in court. And again, money's not part of it. It would be corrective action.
Good to know that last part particularly, because I was just in my own mind thinking about reserve funds. Where do school districts and building administrators, get the time, get the resources, because all of this is going to take an intentional actions on our part.
Yeah, and especially when we're in this, it'd be one thing, for example, if I don't know, a college said, I don't care about students for fair admission. If you check these boxes on the application, you're in. You could be looking at a much more punitive measure for that institution because they had knowledge of clear law and went the other way. Here, we're just dealing with these vague directives. So even if it does come out adverse to you, you have a good chance of prevailing on appeal and no basis for any sort of extreme measure.
Thank you. I just put up a couple slides that are reflective of the survey. One of the ones that I don't have, but I want to tell you about, is that most often when we ask the question on the survey, have your students reacted to any of this information, or has your community reacted to any of this information? Meaning increased discussions, more meetings, students coming to you as building administrators. Pretty much all of the responses were 50, 49. No, we haven't heard much student action. No, there hasn't been much community. But then when I asked the question as, has your school district communicated these federal changes? Interestingly enough, the school districts also have not been really communicating with any of the districts have not been communicating with their parents at all on this either. So, I think we have, as we go forward, that's just something to think about. I don't mean broadcasting information that folks aren't going to use. I don't mean that at all, but there will be, I think, action on all of your parts needed to explain some of these to your community as we go forward. Let me just hit quickly federal funding, because one of the reasons that we're having this first update live is that we do have a team of building administrators going to DC next week. There is a full national building principals, thousands, hundreds at least, coming to DC to advocate on next Wednesday. Clearly, one of the most important issues at the federal level that we will be talking to all of our congressional delegation is the federal funding. So just to give you a sense of where we are with that federal funding, and Daniel, I know that you're watching this as carefully as we are, is that the federal agencies supposedly run out of money on March 14th, which means that Congress will have to take some sort of action. It may mean a continuing resolution. There's variations. I don't mean to bore anybody here, but there's short-term resolutions that are possible, or long-term. Each of those has its own political risks and advantages. But interestingly enough, the House won't even vote on their CR until we are in DC next weekend. And it's next week rather. And remember, it's only in the House. It's a 1-vote margin. So we are watching this carefully. I'm guessing, Daniel, you all are watching it just as carefully we are. So right now, if it's a continuing resolution, what that means is that the spending levels stay the same as last year's appropriations. I don't know how to look at that, Daniel. Maybe you can help me. But I mean, in one way, that's good news. It never was good news. 2 years ago, if we had been advocating on thank you for leaving federal level funding levels the same, we'd be all over our delegation saying, no, we need increases. No, we're not even getting the IDEA money. That's still only funded at 40%. So how is state ed looking at things right now for funding?
Yeah, I think we're in the same position that we're ultimately, I am optimistic that it would really, in every state, school district, there's people who hold a wide variety of political beliefs, and cutting back on broad entitlements that have huge public support, like the title funds, IDEA. I think you would get a bipartisan outcry about that. And I think that's the principle we have to hope for here as best we can, is that there's so much fighting and there's so much dysfunction. But at the end of the day, these, the elected members have to go back to their districts and explain what happened. And I think huge generalized cuts to education is not something that people support. And I should say too, generally, right, when we talked about things, I've been hard on the new administration, but it is really the lawlessness that is our concern and what we are pushing back against most, because I understand that many of you in your districts, you do have people who hold political beliefs all over the spectrum. And I think as much as we can make this not a substance-based argument and more a procedural argument to focus on, just to say, we are a nation of laws. This is what we believe. This is the process we believe in.
I was going to add another comment about the federal funding, but Daniel, I can't think of a better way to end our first update live. You are right. And I think from my own opinion, I think we're very lucky to be in New York State at this point. So with you at State Ed, I know that you're working diligently on this. Let me just throw it out to our crowd here just quickly. Anybody have a concluding comment or question? Otherwise, we're going to probably sign off and give you back the well-deserved time that you all need at the end of the day. Daniel, thank you. Your clarity, you're condensing all of this in a way that we can see a path forward so that we may be able to understand some of these issues a little bit better. We know that this was a very quick kind of an update, quick informational. We will be trying to reach out to you with any questions that you may have. Feel free to contact us at any time, and we will be providing these update live sessions in the future when need arises. So thank you all. Appreciate your time. Daniel, thank you for your time.
Of course. Thank you.
Bye all.